And recently, I've been contracting for Novartis, and I'm responsible for implementing an engine. It's a dynamic form engine that generates form on the fly depending on configuration. And along the development and the architecture of this project, we realized there was quite a few limitations related to the Lightning architecture. Lucky enough, we've been selected to be part of the pilot program of LWC in November. So we've been lucky enough to get to have a play with the framework, and following that, we've started directly using what we've learned and converting the engine we've developed in Lightning to Lightning that will be now called Aura for clarity, to LWC, which stands for Lightning Web Components. So here we will talk about two main strategies. Well, if you read the documentation, there's three. One of them is to keep everything in Aura, but if you ask me, I wouldn't recommend it. Aura is slow, it's clunky, it's difficult to learn, and it's prone to bugs actually on the long term. If you start building complex application, like with dynamic component creation and all this sort of advanced, complicated technique, then most of the time in terms of usage of memory and just to track the potential bugs, it's very complex, especially with the callbacks and everything, and the way it's organized, it makes it very difficult to debug. Now, so we already know we want to move to LWC. Fine. Now, you can either just create your new components and integrate it inside your existing Aura components. And this was it's actually working very well right now, surprisingly. And you can directly instantiate LWC children component inside the parent. So we'll have a look at this. But quick word, it's obviously quicker to implement because you're already reusing your architecture or maybe your parent design in Aura. Now, I don't have like numbers right here, right now. It's a bit too early for real life execution numbers, but already from what I've seen on a complex project, it was something like twice as fast. That's not even a question. Aura is not possible to follow at all LWC performances. So for that reason only will be enough to move to LWC. But there's many other reasons in terms of code clarity, but also on how you can get new resources, because getting resources for Lightning was just impossible. It simply didn't happen. Just learning Lightning was a pain. Now, people who come from the web development world, they probably know about web components because it's not part of Salesforce, it's part of a norm. Now, people who know about web components can actually move to Lightning web components quite easily. And they could even potentially read the code without learning about Salesforce. So, we will spend more time into looking about how to convert everything. It obviously takes effort. You need to learn about LWC, you need to, make mistake, and also, and we will insist on that, there's a couple of features or techniques that people were used to using in Aura and are just not available in LWC. I can assure you that all of these, as frustrating as it may seem when you encounter them, they make sense. I've talked to the people who are behind the development of LWC as well, and they have good reason to prevent you from doing certain stuff in Aura. So my main culprit here is dynamic component creation. So when you, instead of declaratively say, I want this component, you actually instantiate it dynamically in the controller. That sounds fancy, that sounds a cool way of doing it, but it's actually totally forbidden now in LWC. For a very good reason, is that it would create problems where it's impossible to debug. It's impossible to understand what's happening, especially in terms of memory consumptions. Anyway, we will understand that there is no problem that previously needed dynamic component creation that can be solved with LWC out of the box and with declarative effort. Okay, so just to summarize the skill set and tools that's needed for LWC. I've already talked about web components, and that's DOM. It's part of a few features, so including the import, export, the ES6 modules. There's a shadow DOM. We don't need to get into details right now, but what's important to understand is it's not only for Salesforce people, and that's very important because to me, it was one of the reason of the failure of Lightning in real case scenario. Small development teams, no problem, but in big companies, then we just don't find any valid resources. Now, this is, I hope it's only the early days, but so far it seems that it's mostly VS Code for free. In association with SFDX that allows you to access all the features, at least with the auto-completion, and he also finds bugs while you're writing them offline, so it's definitely useful. Now, and this is about, I'm not going to insist too much on this, but this is about I'm really excited about, and I'm already using a lot in the new framework, and it's ES6 and plus, so it goes beyond that, but mostly modules, arrows functions, anything that is related to functional programming, and proper JavaScript as well, will be available in LWC out of the box. Now, that also means that in terms of readability, and I don't know if you've done any Lightning, but it was hell to debug. It was just impossible to even understand what people try to do. Now, this is the past, and proper JavaScript, as long as your programmers and your resources have the required skill set, it will make it for a way more maintainable source code. All right, so let's get into the depth of it. The first thing that we will have a look at is how the file structure is different. And for anyone who's done a lot of Lightning, you will recognize how many of them? I mean, too many files to count. I don't even want to count. Now, this has been streamlined, as you can see, and for the best. And a few things we can notice: HTML, JavaScript, CSS, only norms. We don't recreate anything that is, I don't know, came from some sorcerer in Salesforce, but like why? Why do something like very specific to Salesforce, very hard to understand and difficult to debug, when we can have a good old HTML? It's a presentation layer, it should be only for presentation. And they really outdone themselves in this case, and when you look at an HTML file, the presentation layer now, it looks like a presentation layer. Someone who comes from web development will be able to read your HTML, which was not the case before. Now, all of the front-end logic, you would say, so the controller, will be in a JavaScript file. As mentioned before, this supports proper JavaScript, except it follows the ES6 module format. Takes a little while to get used to it, but in terms of import and export, it makes way more sense. CSS is like before, and then it's just a little bit streamlined in terms of components. Right. So, yeah, I'll show you at the end how it's the scaffolding. So this is how we do it in VS Code, and it's really useful. The Control-Shift-P is just normal show commands of Visual Studio Code, and then you choose where you put it, and automatically will create the scaffolding. So scaffolding being streamlined, it's only the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript files, and then a meta file for the Salesforce specific configuration. All right, so let's talk a little bit technical. You can see some code here. I'm sure it pleases most of you. So the old school way, or array, is to declare an attribute of components, whereas it's public or private. Usually when you want a public attribute, so that the parent can instantiate your child passing an attribute. Well, first, we'll find it in the component file, which is already, if you ask me, not where it should be. Also, it's a tag, which it's not really clear because the tag is HTML, should be presentation, right? So now we're mixing configuration of the component with the presentation layer. Not a good architecture. And if you look at LWC, here we see a few things. So first, the import-export that I mentioned in the past. This is the module import style that's part of the web components. Really what we're saying here is just we're importing Lightning, we're using Lightning elements. And this API means that we will declare some public attributes. These public attributes is the way that you can pass a value from a parent to a child. So we just use decorators to declare this JavaScript attribute, very attribute. And you can also see that it's untyped, as modern JavaScript is often. Now, this is the default value, and that means if it's not filled in by the parent, then it will have a default value. If not, it will be set once as a public attribute from the parent. So this will be your first job when you're converting Aura components to LWC. You will analyze all the different attributes, which is part of the structure of your component, and will, well, most importantly, move them from the presentation layer to your controller. All right, let's talk about one of my favorite parts of LWC. It's funny how it doesn't take a lot of space on the screen, but really, this changed my life. So this is Lightning, really ugly iteration ways of doing things. We see several things here. The Aura custom domain. We see that it uses this quite convoluted way of accessing controllers' attributes. And we see the way of displaying directly a value in the. Now, the LWC way, you have to understand that this for each and is causing if true and if false are the only logical or behavioral items that you will find in the presentation layer. So only if false and for each, that's it. And this will guarantee that your presentation layer is maintainable and it's easier to read. In this case, we use a for each, which is quite a classical way of looping through elements if you've ever done web development. And now you can see that it's using a simplified display to display the element. The rest, template, HTML, right? It could be a div, it could be anything. And that's very key to understand. Salesforce really got back to the core of HTML, of proper HTML and JavaScript. And because you have a proper structure with JavaScript and HTML, then you can use CSS properly. And now the structure of your code and also the division of responsibility between the people developing maybe the business side of your application and the people working on the presentation side of your application can work in different teams now, like properly, because the files are properly separated and there's a clear separation of concern. There will be a few tips like this that I learned from experience. In this case, there's always need to be a unique value when you are inside a template loop. All right. Okay, so I started mentioning about it a bit before. Now it's time to have a look at the main difference in terms of conditional. Yes, conditional. So this is the old Aura way of doing it. And okay, it's not necessarily clear here. I could have made a better example, but this is actually an expression. And everyone who's done Lightning, this will be very difficult to get rid of, this habit of having bidirectional binding with your attributes is normal in Lightning. So that means here, this could be an expression. It could be if, not. You could have an and and or, like really complex expression in there. Also, so that's one thing to understand. Two, this is back to your attribute here. If it's changed in the child, then it's reflected in the parent, and vice versa. Well, this doesn't exist anymore, and we will talk about it a little bit later, but it's important to understand. In LWC, you don't have bidirectional binding. So you only pass from a parent to a child. You can't pass value from a child to a parent by attribute. Very important. Now, the other valid thing to notice about this expression that I mentioned before. The fact that it's an expression makes it, well, easier for the developers because you can put logic in here, right? And often you need logic. You need to, it's going to be like, should I display that? Well, it depends if this equals this and this and this and this. And the fact that you can't do that anymore, first, it's a bit frustrating, but think about it. This is logic. It's logic, it's business logic, and this is not testable. No one can test it, which means, well, you've got business logic lost somewhere and no chance of catching regression. Not a good architecture decision. In this case, you see this something, it can't be an expression. It needs to be coming from a getter. And that means that if you have any logic to understand if you should display something or not, fine, you put in a getter. If it's in a getter, it's testable. It seems stupid at first, but it's very important if you care about code quality in a large scale, because you want your code coverage to cover the maximum of your business logic. And unfortunately, often the logic on the presentation layer is the one failing and is the one getting regressions. Also, it's not regressions, not code, tend to, well, makes the business owners a bit angry. All right, so let's brush quickly on how the conditionals are done in LWC to any HTML. So it's a really clean way of just adding to the HTML. And there's only if true and if false. This needs to be a getter, as I mentioned before. It can't be a computed expression. And sometimes it sounds a bit annoying, especially when you convert, because you will have like this will be the result of several values that you link together and it creates a certain logic. Well, that means that in your constructor or somewhere in LWC, when you gather this data, you need to be able to, well, pass it into a JSON object. And in this JSON object, you will have getters. And that's the beauty of JavaScript. You can use functions everywhere as input, output, functional programming is key. So what you can do is you just add to your data structure that you will return from the controller these getters that will tell the front end if they should display or not. So again, rather than having the logic here, you move it to somewhere it should be, which is, well, the constructor that gets the data, reads it, constructs the new form of the data, including with the getters that you will need to have to know if you should display or not.
The order of execution, if the logic is dependent on the importing attributes, the issue with our instance is not the issue. Design is that whenever you're going to pass the attributes from the parent component to the child component, the initial getter may not have the values, yeah? Is this different here?
Yes, because the getter will be...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Well, maybe you want to...
The question was if the getter is getting after the setters, pretty much. If you can pass from parent to child the number of the attributes, and you needed to set up the getters, will this be done in that order?
So it's a valid question in terms of order of execution, and actually LWC clarified that. They have a list of hooks, I think they called it, and that will execute at different stages of execution. And it's pretty clear about when, in terms of memory, instantiation, and all the complex situation. And they have this new initialization system. It's not a method init as it was before. Didn't make any sense. And now it's a connected callback, it's called. And then you have other hooks that can tell you if the initialization is finished. And so you're sure that you have the right value. Now, personally, in the connected callback, I've done that. So I get the data. It's an Apex method. And then remember, like JSON objects are unlimited. You're not limited to structure of Salesforce, Apex, or anything. So if you want to add getters in your JSON object, that's not an issue at all. And then as long as this getter is readable from the data that you send to the front end. So it's not exactly a getter like in Apex. Well, actually, it's not at all like in Apex. You have more freedom in JavaScript, in modern JavaScript. All right, let's move on. Okay, so here I explain a little bit about this expression. thing. So you see here with this if else, that very, very common in Lightning. So you have this logic, really, it's logic, that looking at something, and then depending on this, we'll decide if this should be displayed or not. So this is what we're trying to avoid, because this logic should be tested, and now it cannot be, it's just impossible. So it does sound a little bit annoying at first, but when you understand why they make you do that, then you realize that having this condition just as a clear getter from the controller makes sense, because that is testable. Okay, so here this is just to insist on well, the small stuff made of the migration effort, and it's the small characters that will take you more time, but as you can see, it's slightly different. First, we forget about this aura if non-HTML tag. Then the syntax is a little bit different, but also we don't have the colon, and we don't have the exclamation mark. Also, this VC crazy. Oh, that was complicated, and it doesn't even makes like the same sense. It doesn't even mean the same thing depending on where you are. Okay, now we just have a condition. That's it. So I insist, no exclamation mark, no V, no colon. Also, only getter, no expression. Well, I think I've driven the point home now. Let's talk to, well, now we're here. So, yes, this dreaded init method. Oh, it took me 3 months to remember how to write this, and I still didn't really understand. So that's supposed to mean that there will be an initialization method, which seems like a normal thing to do, and then you have to write it like this. So that's Lightning. Oh, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. LWC, we have this idea of connected callback, different hooks. These hooks will be automatically handled by the framework. It's important to understand that framework has control on your memory management and execution, the thread execution. It also has an impact on the DOM. You can't have that directly access the DOM, you access the shadow DOM. A couple of rules like this that really what they're trying to do is to avoid this very complex business case where it's just impossible to debug. I think that they have some situation which they gave up, really. They just say, no, we can't help you. All right, this is better. It's just simple initialization at the end of the loading of the shadow DOM. Don't take my word from it, but I think it's specifically after it finished loading the shadow DOM, which means you have access should have been loaded. So it's a real constructor, I guess. So initialization hooks, I guess, is the best thing. But what you need to understand is here, anytime that you will redisplay, reload a component, this will be executed. So if you have some code that should be executed only once, that's not where it should be. But if you have initialization code that will refresh data or makes a complex business decision and will have an impact on the display, that will be the right place.
Question. For if you want the expressions to be available to the presentation layer, do the variables in the JavaScript need to be scoped at a certain level? Or do you just invoke the variable name from wherever it lives in the JavaScript?
So that's a good question, actually. There's a few differences in terms of how you define your attributes in your JavaScript controllers, and you use decorators, as we've seen before with the API. So you have two decorators for attributes. You have API and track. So if you just declare an attribute, it will be private. If you declare a track attribute, it will be private reactive. If you declare an API attribute, it will be public reactive. So anything that you need to pass from the parent to the child will be a API way of doing. Now inside the controller, you use a this dot to reference attributes, but you don't necessarily make any difference between the three types of attributes. So it's The decorators is more for how you will use them in your presentation layer or passing values to it. But inside the controller, just the this and the attribute directly accessible. There's a way as well you can put your own JavaScript attributes. So it could be like totally private, but you could define your own custom getter and setters. And then even in these getter and setters, you can have business logic. And that's actually pretty clean because these getter and setters will be tested. And so rather than do that in the presentation layer, you do it in a custom getter or setter. No?
Yeah, thank you.
Right, so let's, so this time on the release date, they had, let's say, most of the base components already available for LWC, and well, that's kudos to Salesforce. It must have been quite a heavy work. Now we just look at the way to pass from one format to the new one. So here we have the old school column with the cut case. So I think this is called kebab case. Well, I don't know if we use this term every day. Now, so this tricked me a few times. This is actually not valid. You can't pass a Boolean literal. It's I'm not sure why yet, but I think it's a norm. It's somewhere in the norm. Now, you pass it like this. This means true. But if you pass this, then it will not understand that it's a Boolean. You need to pass an expression. And that's quite important because I used to do that a lot in Lightning. That's not available in LWC. Apart from that, you need the full closing tag. I don't know why, but fine. Fine. And apart from that, that's about it. So really, anything when you use any base components, you can just, without even like transform it, convert it directly to the LWC format, and that will work. I don't think I found one like his associated attribute. The only thing you don't have is Aura ID, which I always hated anyway, so I'm happy to get rid of it.
Laurent, so you said that we can't use linkify equals true in LWC. So is that a ES6 thing? You just kind of specify the
I don't have the answer to this question. I don't know where it came from. They said that it's part of a norm, but I don't remember exactly what part. I just know that this means equal true, or you can do equal and then you pass an expression. And then this expression can be anything that is computed in your JavaScript component. Like the way I know is you pass an expression. You pass a getter. It needs to return false. So you can create a getter that returns false and then you pass it. That's fine. But I think it's just to really understand that this is a string literal. And it will be computed as such. I think that's why really they wanted to clarify that. But yeah, it would be worth understanding why, like where does it come from, what norm does it come from, I'm not sure. Okay, this is 2 short lines, but believe me, they make me happy. This event management system in Lightning, I mean, it takes months to understand. So you have register event, you have handler, then the name is not the same. Sometimes it's action, sometimes it's value. The name of the attribute is like, right. And why do I need to register event on the parent? And well, okay, you understand? It's really messy. Really, right now, this just disappeared. It's not even converted to something equally as complex. It's just you don't need that. If you're publishing an event, well, do it. Just use the normal JavaScript. I mean, we'll have a look a bit of the code, but it's standard JavaScript actually. You just instantiate a custom event and you dispatch it. You don't need any complex Lightning. It's really hard to learn actually. Just to pass an event to your parent was not an easy thing. Also, you don't need to specify if anyone is supposed to manage it, handling it, or anything. And we will have a look at how it's written a little bit after, but you can directly, declaratively define that your handler at the parent component level. So You know how you on an input you say on mouse click and then you do something. Well, that's exactly how you're going to define the handler in LWC. So very clean and very similar to how you would do it in normal jQuery, JavaScript, anything. I knew I would show you some code here. Okay, so first limitation, and that's actually quite a big one for some existing project. No application event. So I don't know how many people are very advanced in Lightning, but then you must have known that there's two types of events. There's component events, which is your normal parent to child, child to parent events, and then this application event, which is this sort of a global event that anyone can catch. It was a good idea. It was a good idea. It just didn't work. Now, anyone who's used application event has probably found out that as soon as something doesn't work, you're lost. There's no way to understand where it comes from or to track what should happen. So what started as a good idea for developers ended up being a very bad idea for businesses. I know it can be frustrating when you're migrating because your application can be based on that. But that's exactly when you should doubt your architecture decision. It's the same thing with the expression in the front-end layer. It's the same thing with the lack of dynamic component creation. They are valid decisions by the Salesforce teams. And in this case, this application event is a gateway to hell, I can tell you that. Now, the only thing we have is one sort of event. And it's a standard event that you initialize in exactly the way that people using web components know. Now, this is code that first, well, anyone could read, but more specifically, people who are used to do normal web development. And that's beautiful. That's something like you write code, Salesforce code, and anyone else, a new resource coming from the web development team can read the code. So yes to that. Now what do we see? Custom event is an object provided on the top of the DOM, basically. You just specify the name of your event. These are a couple of options. We don't need to look into too much details. And finally, you pass your payload, your data. This dispatch event is also a classic method to send events in web development. All right, so now that we've seen how to produce an event, and I've already mentioned that we don't need this complex register, event, handler, tags on the front-end layer. Now, how do we do that? We talked about this declarative way of handling events on a parent, and I actually quite like that. You remember how this event was called navigation in the previous code? Well, on the parent, that's it. On navigation, that's it. It's really easy to read, and then you put your handler. That's enough. So I really like the way that they rewrote the event handling management. And then, what do we have? Very simple again. Here is your handler. You will always have this attribute of events so that you can event. And then you can read the payload directly using the .javascript way. So object, JSON object. So you have the event, you get into the details, and this is the details of your payload. Very simple, very easy to read, easy to maintain. And it's unbelievable that it doesn't take more than that to understand how to do event handling, but that's it, really. With that, you're good to go. Right, now we get to the core of the Salesforce specific features, and usually when you start using these different frameworks, you want to get access to your business logic. You want to get access to your data. So you want to call Apex. You want to have interaction with your business layer. So I didn't even put how it was done in Lightning. I think I was just ashamed of putting it on a public space. But it really was very complex to call an Apex method in Lightning. First you had to import it with a C. Well, let's not even talk about it. It was complex. Too complex. Too complex, and the error handling was even worse. like no one knew what was the best practice. Everyone wrote it differently. It was like 50 lines of code just to receive a string from an Apex method, but very difficult. Now, this import thing is part of this move to the norms, so the web components norm and the modules. So it used this import for many more things than just the DOM specific features, and I really like that because it makes it quite consistent to learn how to write LWC. And here the import is specifically to import a method. So we give it a name, and we just say that, oh, by the way, this VS Code automatically finds this, which is really nice. And then any method that actually publish this is how you write Apex code that will be available for Lightning or LWC. The cacheable is only if you... Hello? Yeah, okay. So that's a simple method really that is accessible just by using the annotation or enabled. The cacheable is to, if it's only readable information, this will need to be refreshed and you don't need a call out. Anything, we'll come back to that, but you can gain enormous execution and the why have a look at just after that. Okay, so here we see an example of an import. This controller is my class controller, and it's the one where I put all my business layer functions. So anything that access Apex data, anything that have any sort of business logic will be put in there. Now I do an import, and inside the JavaScript controller, and this will be a bit different, you can call it directly. So really this import transforms your server-side controller into a front-end controller accessible in JavaScript. So here we call the method in JavaScript, and that's really cool because you don't need any new way of calling it. It's just accessible because you did the import. Now you pass JSON object, and this is important. Oh yeah, I think I wrote it here. It needs to be named here like this. You can't just pass the value. It's a JSON object, so it needs to have the exact name of the attributes of the method in Apex. So this is how you pass value to your server-side method. And then, so one thing important, this is imperatively. There's two ways of calling Apex, but this is the imperative way of calling Apex. So you do that when you want to know when exactly you're doing this call. So anything that will depend on timing, or if value change you need to recall, or you need to wait until initialization of other components, any case like this, you will call it at a specific moment. So as you all know, this will be asynchronous. But the old callback asynchronous way of writing Lightning.
For people who don't know, what are promises?
Yes. Yeah. So Lightning was working with callbacks, and the problem with callbacks, and if you want to chain different calls, then it becomes really complex to read. And even to write, really. 3 calls in a row is very, very difficult to write on a normal screen, and even more difficult to maintain. And it also doesn't make a lot of sense for a lot of people. Well, this is called promises. Here, we say we do an asynchronous call, and whenever that resolves, then we execute what's inside the then. The beauty of that is that the then returns a promise as well. So you can chain initialization call or any sort of calls, you can chain them and catch. It's very common in modern web development. There's different ways of doing promises. You have the async wait for people who are into the most modern version of JavaScript. But I think they removed it from LWC for some reason, because I think it was creating some issues. So we'll stay with the old school promises way of writing it, but I'm very happy about that. Promises are amazing. If you don't use them, you really need to learn how to use them. What do we see here? So really, what it does is it will do this filter. When this is finished, when we receive the valid answer, then from the input of the output of the previous method is going to get into the input into the then. This is what we call a narrow function. So it's modern JavaScript, and it's more into how to change everything to a function. But really what it says is that as an input, if you take an input this, I will execute this. And finally, you can have a global catch, and you can treat any sort of errors. So like this, it doesn't look like much, but as soon as you will try to time asynchronous, like to synchronize asynchronous calls, and you need the answer of one to be able to fit into another one, well, chaining promises will change your life, really. It's amazing, it's clean, it's easy to read. And it's available out of the box on LWC. Okay, so let's talk about.
Laurent, sorry,
yes.
the previous one was called when there's actually the. It will be called or on the log?
It will be called. Let me show. So this does a call. Yes, so it's not time. It's you decide you do. I do the call. Yeah. Just this will be executed when it's received. But we'll see on the next slide. There's a way when you don't know when we will be executed. So that's why I say imperatively and to the other way. It will make more sense when we have a look at the wire. Remember I told you there was two decorator for attributes, API and track, so public and private reactive attributes. Well, there's a third decorator that's used a lot in Lightning, and it's called wire. So we do the same import as before, so that's good, it's the same way of using it. Now, this @wire, what it says is that you will let the framework decide how it's executed, refreshed, and cache management. You can force stored cache to be refreshed, but in reality, the framework will ensure that you will get better performance, especially in terms of cache management. So this is perfect for anything that reads data and that not be invalid regularly. So when you read just a list of contacts and you display that to your users, well, you don't need to redo the so-called every time if it's not going to change parameters. Well, this, especially if you remember this cacheable equal true on the Apex side that we put, well, wire is only possible on cacheable Apex method. Obviously, it makes sense. And this will ensure that the framework will take care of any sort of optimization for you. Also, it will not call the method again if it knows that the data is still valid. And that is core to the sort of better performance that we see in LWC. It's not only about how it renders a DOM, it's also about all these requests that it doesn't send to the server anymore, especially when it's large, very complex data request. Well, we don't need to get too much into details here, but what this technique is called wire through a method. So this is a method, and then it receives a JSON object with error and data, and then you can do whatever you want. It's a bit of a different way of writing method, and also at first, for anyone who was used to say, well, I want to execute the method, I execute it. It's a bit different. It's a bit surprising, but I think it makes sense just because I believe like 70% of the so-called requests are used to get data that is already available with. So just by using this, you can make sure that your applications are faster. Okay, let's talk more about imports. It's a very important concept for LWC, as you can see, and I really like that they're using for a lot of different features. So we've already looked at importing methods and then using them for wire or declaratively. Well, actually, you can import name and object reference yes, from the backend. So what does it do? This will ensure that any change of names to fields, objects, anything, any change of reference of your data model will be prevented if you have a reference to it. So you know the same way when you try to change a field object and then it tells you it's used in a class? Well, this is not Apex, but with this reference it will know. Also, if the name change, if the label change or something like this, it will know as well. So it's quite a good way to keep your reference validity between your backend and your code. Also, you can, this is, we're talking about getters. So this is specific to LWC on how you write a getter. And this is, you can see logic here, rather than having it in your front end, you have it in the controller. And here, you can use this reference to fields with this sort of out-of-the-box method, and that will get the value directly from the object you're passing on. So this is an example of how you use the field reference and the object reference. It takes a little bit more time to write, but it will guarantee that your code base has a better overall validity, especially like when people change without talking to each other, can make things very complex. So this ensures the quality on the long term. Oh yes, right, it helps for deployment as well. Yes, very important.
Wow.
Yeah?
Hello. In this case, this is a custom controller for contact. There's no standard contact controller, or is it? The one you're importing at the beginning, the first line, contact controller.
Yes, no, yeah, no, custom. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, this one was custom. It's not, yeah, because you can see it's from Apex. Yeah, well, no, that means that it's only custom code. But a way to import specific methods from Salesforce, and that will not be from Apex, it will be from another domain. And this actually is one of them. So this is a utility method that allows you to get a value using a field reference. So this you need to import it as well. I should probably have put it in there.
So this method returns the value of the object?
Yes, it does. So here, I think this is the object, this is a field reference, and it gets the value. Okay. It's just a good way. Oh yeah, because you don't need any Apex, you don't need to do any requests. This is directly communicating with it. All right, so we are now back to this bidirectional binding concept that I was talking about. So I want to insist on this because in my personal experience, this is the part that I struggled with the most. It was even to a point where I just didn't know how to convert one of my existing components. So we're talking about bound expression here, and as I mentioned before, using this sort of expression, you pass value from a parent to a child by just passing it as an attribute. But very important concept to understand, if the child changes the attribute, then the parent will directly have access to that. So it's kind of, you can have like a trail of parent to child with their attributes linked, which is great because then you don't even have to update the values at the parents. But then you lose sense of who changed it, and it's a concept of like, you know, if you receive a data and you change it, then it should be in a modular way. If you can't change data that you don't own. Different ways in LWC, but they have this complex concept of shadow DOM and this encapsulation of the DOM of any component. So really a component should only be a black box. Now, if it's a black box, then it can't change things that it doesn't own, including things that are outside of him, which is exactly what a bidirectional binding does. Now, if you can't pass back the information that you just changed in your child component directly in an attribute, well, how is the parent supposed to know what is through event? And everything will be through event now. So we'd better get used to it. So the data binding is one way, so only from parent to child. Okay, and in case of public attribute, you can only set them once, the value, when you instantiate the child component. Now, if you want to send an updated value, then you just send an update. You've seen how easy it was to just produce an event and to dispatch it. And then also as a parent, you just say on the name of the event, you treat the result of the event. We also saw that by using the payload, we can pass information. So all of this together, that's how you will get information from the parent, from the child to the parent. And a key point here, let's see if I talk about that. Yes. Because I think it's a good use case of what I'm trying to explain here. This part is important. There is no auto wire from the value of a select. So first, a select is not called a select now. Our pick list is called a combo box. Okay, fine. Now you see, before we used to bind value like this, and this meant if the combo box changed the value here, well, we just have to read this and we would get the value. So it was like direct. Now, even for an out-of-the-box components like combo box, it doesn't do it. You need to actually have the on-change event. You need to receive the event that it changed. And it's a bit confusing at first, but when you understand that everything is event-based, then it makes sense. So you need to actually put your own change event, so that's the name of the event of the combo box, and they work exactly the same way. Huh? The standard components or your own components work the same way. It's the same event, same style. You declare your handler, and then you will read the event detail.value. So even for a standard component such as a combo box, it's still the same way of receiving values from a child. And really, when you understand that, then you understand how to do the architecture for your own components. And anything that will modify the values that you passed, if you want to receive it, you need to dispatch an event. Okay, so this was mainly about converting your components to LWC and also to understand the differences between the two. Now, the first thing I've tried, and I invite you to try as well, is to make them work together. I was really happy to see that it worked very early on, the two of them together. So in terms of how you build that, it's only in one direction. It's only Aura components can be parent of child LWC components, not the other way around. Also, like with all the different containers that you have in Aura, you can have lightning out, it can be a part of community, it can be part of console, anything like this. Well, the container needs to be in Aura, and then you can instantiate directly LWC components. And for once, it's the way that you would imagine doing it. Well, it's exactly how you do it. So this is an Aura component, and as you can see, it's container. It's like you can actually put it in some different pages. You have a lightning card, a classic. Now, this is an LWC component, and you use the Aura way of writing it. You see, it's not a dash here, so it's important. This is not the LWC way. Also, it's camel case and not kebab case, which means this is an Aura component, and you use the Aura writing style to instantiate your LWC component. You just prefix it with your custom domain, and that's it, really. So that's how you would just instantiate the Lightning web components inside an Aura component. Did we talk about that already? Ah, well, yes. Oh no, sorry. Now we're in the situation where we have both Aura and LWC, and the same way as before, we will use events to communicate. So this is the LWC code, and then I'm using the DOM code to dispatch an event, exactly as we've seen before. And here, I can have the handler directly receiving the events in Aura. So if you produce events in LWC, the parent Aura component can receive it and deal with the result. No, yeah, it's finished. All right, so I hope that clarifies a little bit about the relationship and the differences between Aura and LWC and the strategy on how to move from one framework to another. Do you have any questions?
I think we'll come get back to you. So a few questions here.
Probably says Internet Explorer doesn't have the.
Sorry, can you repeat those?
So does Lightning Web Components work with Internet Explorer?
Yeah, it does. Valid question. So it uses polyfields. So it's a JavaScript technique, or it's actually a functional programming technique to replace an unavailable method with another one without being intrusive. So that's how they use. That's what they use to make all semi-modern browser available. Include with an ES6 as well. You know how with Lightning, like the some features were just like not really available depending on what. Now, at least for me, I haven't noticed anything. It works on everything I've tried.
We have lighting design system using lighting components. What do we use here? Just HTML or other?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. So the LDS, the Lightning Design System, which the name is a bit confusing, but it's actually independent of Lightning, which means it can totally be used in LWC because it's only a set of norms in terms of presentation layer, but it's not directly tied to Lightning at all, actually. So as long as you're using the classes, the CSS classes the same way, and then your tag can be moved from one to the other, no problem. I didn't change anything at all in my project in terms of styling at all, zero. It's just, so as long as it was following the LDS before, shouldn't be any problem.
Thanks. Two questions. One of them is hopefully very quick. If your code, you have access to the window object again, and if not, then how do you navigate? And then the other question is, does the DOM that is drawn by LWC support headless UI testing with stuff like Jasmine?
Thank you for these two beautiful questions. So no, you don't have access to the window object directly. It's using this thing called Shadow DOM. It's it's part of the web components norm.
Can you explain what Shadow DOM is?
So it's not a direct representation of the DOM. You don't relate it to this encapsulation concept that I mentioned in the past, that the components need to be only self-aware and doesn't touch anything else. Now the Shadow DOM, what it does is that it prevents any access to the inside of a component. Now you still have access to the DOM, but really they're trying really hard for you not to do it. Really, really hard. Now in terms of navigation, use events. They have a whole mechanism. It's not part of this presentation specifically, but it's because they're working on it as we speak, because it depends on the containers, you know, console, lightning out, community, it's all different. So I think they're still working on it, but as far as I understand, it's events based. And the other, so in terms of testing, I know that they're using this local testing Jest. But for the headless testing, no, I don't know. I can't tell you. Sorry.
So on the developer week event, where some of the actual product team and developer team for Lightning Web Components came over, there was a big section on testing there, and they do support Jasmine amongst other testing frameworks. they did a side-by-side comparison against a few JavaScript testing frameworks. I can't remember which one came out top, but that was definitely sort of one of the ones listed, and there's some slides available somewhere.
I'm realizing I said Jasmine when I meant was Selenium.
So if you're attending London Scaffolding next week, we have our very own Keir Bowden doing a talk about Selenium and testing Lightning components, Lightning web components. Yeah, I think. I may be all promising, but yeah, it's not here. Ready to deliver now. No worries.
You mentioned that the global application events are not supported, yeah? I was not fan of it either, but do you have any advice if somebody used that? I mean, have a top component overall to kind of do the navigation between the components, or what's the approach you should suggest?
So I would personally suggest to change your architecture in this case, because it probably was a mistake during the whiteboarding activity. But I know it's not easy all the time, and so they provided the first version of LWC during the pilot program with their self library, publisher library, but they did their own. So they stored the events into the JSON object, and then they call them depending on the map. But that's their own thing, and they know it's not production ready, and they know people are a bit confused about the lack of application events. But I think they're still working on it, right?
Okay. So just follow-up question. So if you have more complex application with multiple kind of components and pages, what is like navigation approach you suggest? Like having one dispatcher to do the navigation, or there are the other, best patterns?
I personally use a dispatcher. So the project I've worked on is an engine, a form engine, and he has a parent engine itself, and that receives the events, navigation event. Depending on that, it knows which component to display and handle the navigation. And then on the lower level, any component is not aware of the parent. It's totally independent. It only knows what it should receive and the event that it produces, and that's all. And following this, you have a nice encapsulation concept applied to your different components.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question.
So, how do I load the jQuery?
Sorry?
How do you load jQuery?
Like anything? Or I had to, after scripts loaded,
Like connected callback?
No, just
like
third-party libraries.
Oh, yes.
If you want to build a React app in it.
Yeah, I think it's now okay. So, in December, they didn't really have a good way to import external library. The only way to do was if it was a valid ES6 module. But I think now, since mid-January, they allow a non-ES6 module to be imported. Well, miserably. I didn't even manage to do a color picker example. So I don't know how it is now, but I think they simplified it.
Yeah, so I don't know the full details, but some of the stuff that they demonstrated in order to be able to do that at the developer week was to, you have to have it as a static resource, you can't use CDNs, and depending on what you're trying to do, you have to actually specify manual DOM or manual DOM equal true, or some effectively anything that's manipulating the DOM, you're kind of on your own. You have to specify manual DOM and then manage that itself. And what you may or may not want to do to the DOM.
Okay, if you have any follow-up questions, I'm sure Laurent will be here afterwards. That was